This is Crosscut Reports. I'm Maliha Sayed. Today, we're looking at whether Washington's effort to distribute COVID relief money to small businesses worked as intended.
Now, this program is especially targeting the small businesses with very few employees in our state because they are having a harder time qualifying for federal grant programs.
Washington set up a program to make pandemic dollars more accessible to people around the state. Officials prioritized specific businesses for the funding, such as those owned by people of color. Crosscut reporter Brandon Block followed this money to see how the program worked in practice and to see if it ended up reaching the people it was meant to help. Could you tell me a little bit about your story and a little bit about the program that Washington started?
Sure. So my story is about the Washington State COVID-19 Business Relief Program.
So new today, the governor announcing a competitive grant for small businesses that are hurting because of the COVID-19 outbreak.
Which goes by the name Working Washington is what they decided to call it. This was primarily in 2020 and 2021, and they were trying to target relief to small businesses that maybe didn't qualify for federal programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, or just otherwise were not served by those types of federal efforts. Prior to this story, the information about who received those grants was not available because it hadn't been published by the state. So we requested that line-by-line, grant-by-grant data and have now published it and have done some analysis, and this story is that.
And to clarify, for the program, these are federal relief dollars that are being funneled through the state. These aren't state dollars.
The vast majority of them, yes, are federal money that are coming through the state. The state pitched in a little bit of its own money, but for the most part, it's federal money.
And how much is it?
So the Working Washington program ended up being a little over $400 million. But then there was also an additional, just this past July, they put out an additional $75 million, which was not titled Working Washington, but was very similar. And so altogether, we're looking at close to $500 million.
And you had mentioned that it was intended to reach small businesses in the state who maybe didn't qualify for the federal funding. Is there a reason why they weren't able to access it?
There's a lot of different reasons. I think the first one being that, especially the Paycheck Protection Program, that was rolled out really early in the pandemic and was exhausted within weeks.
This program really had overwhelming demand from day one, which is why you're seeing so many small businesses scrambling right now.
So if you didn't act quickly or didn't have a relationship with a lender, because it wasn't money that was coming directly from the government, it was coming out through banks. So especially businesses owned by people of color or in kind of disadvantaged neighborhoods where maybe they didn't have previous relationships with lenders or just weren't as well sort of versed in the financial world, a lot of times those businesses, and this is what previous analysis of PPP has shown, that those businesses disproportionately did not receive those loans in as high rates as white businesses, for example. And then I think there was also the challenge of there was just more need than there was money to go around. And also you had the challenge of with PPP, some much larger businesses were able to qualify and were able to access those funds before some of the smaller businesses were able to get in there. And then there's also just kind of specific eligibility things. So one of the people that I interviewed for this story is the owner of a barber shop in Linwood in Snohomish County. And his employees are technically independent contractors. So he didn't qualify for PPP because that was based on the amount of employees that you had.
They're independent contractors. Yeah, they're a business inside of my business.
So the business structure could influence that too. He got 2 grants.
And did they kind of fit the bill of who the state said that they intended to help, like communities of color or historically underserved communities?
Yeah, so the owner, this guy, CJ, his name is Clifford, but he goes by CJ Jones. He's a black man who has started this business, about 20 years ago.
It asks you to tell about your business, too, like in the application. And I was just saying I was I've been here 20 years. I'm a part of the community. I take care of the kids. And I don't know, I gotta sell it. But I was being honest, though.
And it's a pretty small business, and it's just this one location. So I think this is kind of exactly the type of business that this program was targeting. I would say the other thing about it is that the grants were of a modest size compared to, especially the federal programs where companies got, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, depending on the size of the business.
So generally, these are grants, like you said, the size is not really comparable to what businesses were getting through federal programs.
Yeah, it's much smaller than PPP, certainly. One of the companies that received a lot of money was this very popular group of Seattle restaurants run by the chef Ethan Stowell. They run over a dozen restaurants in Seattle and some in other cities. And they combined received about $400,000, a little over $400,000, which was one of the companies that received the most money that we found in the data. But we're talking about each individual restaurant, maybe $20,000, $30,000. And I interviewed Ethan Stowell, and his take was kind of that, obviously they're super appreciative to have this, but it's that kind of money isn't really making or breaking whether any of these restaurants survived. I think he said, maybe that is a couple weeks of payroll at one of the restaurants. So certainly the amount of impact that these grants were having varied depending on the size of the business. For a really small business like this barbershop, that was really helpful. For a restaurant in Seattle, maybe that's not going as far.
We'll get into some of the specifics, but I'd just be curious to know off the cuff, what did you find? Like when you were comparing what the money was intended for versus how it was distributed? Yeah,
I think what we found is that, unfortunately, the data is not kind of comprehensive enough to make some of the determinations about whether or not the program achieved its intended goals. And so we asked the Department of Commerce, who was in charge of this program, if they could produce any kind of evidence showing that they had achieved the goals that they set out, or that were set out for them, I should say. They were specifically directed to prioritize, quote unquote, disadvantaged communities, and specifically to prioritize Black and Indigenous people of color business owners. But the data is tricky because, unfortunately, it wasn't tracked. Like that information about business owners' race was not collected in every round. So we have that information for some rounds and not others. The Department of Commerce also said that those questions were voluntary. And so they believe that those numbers are underreported. And so there are some ambiguities and some challenges around the data that kind of make it hard to determine. I don't think we're ready to say that it failed because of the sort of difficulties in the data, but there's nothing overwhelmingly suggesting that it was a success.
The Department of Commerce says they're legally prevented from requiring those that got the grants to disclose their race or ethnicity, but did the state, either in your research or in your conversations, did you see anywhere or hear them indicate how they even intended to prioritize communities of color or historically underserved communities? If they weren't going to track it, did they say how they would prioritize them?
No, they didn't. I asked them about that, and the person who I interviewed who was in charge of this program basically just said that he didn't know. And the other thing I asked was, okay, if there are all these limitations to the data that you're describing, then how do you measure success? And they didn't really have an answer to that question either.
And then you also kind of focus on the different grant amounts that businesses received. So it sounded like some are getting upwards of $170,000. I was most curious about the beauty salon that got $40. Did you find other gaps like that where some businesses are getting hundreds of thousands of dollars and others are getting less than 100?
Yeah, we did. So the largest single award, as you mentioned, was $170,000. The grants, generally speaking, got bigger and bigger over time. So this program started in, I believe, April of 2020. And then the last round just went out this past July. And yeah, over the course of that time, each round kind of got successively larger, culminating in this huge fourth round, which was like $240 some million. So over half of the money went out in that one round. So yeah, the largest individual grants were $170,000. But one of the things that we found was that some sort of larger corporate entities that, maybe own a bunch of locations of a chain submitted multiple applications and were actually able to receive hundreds of thousands of dollars by applying multiple times, which raises some questions about whether they were the types of businesses that this program was targeting. I think the most emblematic example of this that we found was there's a group of gyms, of Orange Theory fitness gyms.
And this is the national chain, Orange Theory.
Yeah, this is an international chain.
Orange Theory workouts are designed by experts.
Different franchises are owned by different organizations or people, but in this case, there's a company that owns dozens of locations in Washington and also in Texas, in Florida and Texas, which is where this company is based. They refer to themselves as the largest independently operated group of Orange Theory fitness gyms in their promotional materials, at least. I haven't verified that, but that's how they refer to themselves. So this is a pretty large company. They reported over $20 million in annual revenue across all of their Seattle locations in their application, but they submitted applications on behalf of each gym.
And so they were doing this by just essentially each particular business, even if it's part of this broader chain, they were applying for a grant each round or however many rounds under each business by location. Like this was not something that they were doing under the guise of Orange Theory as a whole.
That's correct. Yeah, and each of the gyms had a different name in the application. So if you were just looking at it and you didn't have any background on this company, it's possible to think that they're different companies. The way that we found it is because in these two particular rounds, they asked for an applicant name, and the applicant name is the same on all of them. And so then we were able to track the name of the business, and it's a holding company for another company. And I think the particular reason that this is relevant is because the program was targeted to businesses that earn under $5 million a year in revenue. That was the specific direction that the legislature gave to the Department of Commerce in terms of who should qualify. So if you're looking at, this individual gym would qualify because they're bringing in less than $5 million a year. But if you're looking at this gym as part of this larger company that owns dozens of gyms, then the revenue is well over that. So it was sort of an ambiguity in how the program was administered that companies like this were allowed to receive multiple awards. And I asked the Department of Commerce about this, and they basically just said that they were not required to consider the ownership structure of the applicant.
Well, also the program, like you mentioned, it's intended to reach historically underserved communities in BIPOC businesses. But in your story, you outlined some ways that BIPOC businesses were maybe not able to access the funding or struggle to access the funding. And there were barriers that seemed to specifically affect them. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that was definitely the case with a lot of the federal programs like PPP. I will say from the folks that I've talked to, the part of the goal of this program was for it to be more accessible. It was framed as grants rather than as forgivable loans, which definitely was something that made some people hesitant to apply for PPP because just the whole idea of, is it a grant? Is it a loan? Am I going to have to pay this back? What kind of risk am I opening up myself to? That was definitely a concern that a lot of business owners, particularly business owners of color, voiced. And so, I think the fact that these were presented as grants made them more accessible. And I think for the most part, people that I talked to said they felt like working Washington was pretty straightforward in terms of the application process. There were less requirements about what you could do with the money. So I heard a lot of positive things about the intent to kind of streamline this. and make it a little bit more accessible. Having said that, I also talked to some folks who run businesses who are immigrants who English is not their first language, who struggled with some of the technical requirements of applying. Particularly, I spoke to this woman, her name's Tina Hong, and she runs a teriyaki restaurant in Everett. And she actually did qualify for one round of Working Washington grants, but then was rejected in another round because there was a very specific piece of information that she needed to provide called a unique entity identification. It's like a federal code, basically, that you need to go on a website and find. And she just wasn't able to find it. And so was rejected from that round of Working Washington that required it. So so things like that where just sort of technical or language challenges for people for whom English is not their first language was a barrier for some folks.
Looking back at how this program operated and was distributing its funding, are we able to draw conclusions about how effective it was, or is it hard to say because very little data was tracked?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say whether or not it achieved the kind of more specific goals that it had. I think you can point broadly to, and certainly the state would say, we distributed close to $500 million, that we got it out, as fast as we could in a very fluid time. There have been some criticisms of the amount of time, particularly this last round that went out in July of this year was actually budgeted a full year earlier, and so took quite a while to get out. So there certainly have been criticisms of the amount of time it took for that funding to get out. So yeah, I think it's a little bit hard to say whether it achieved the goal of like reaching these particular businesses that it sought to reach. It certainly reached businesses. Whether it was the ones that it was supposed to is a little bit harder to say.
Thanks for listening to Crosscut Reports. This episode was reported by Brandon Block. It was produced by Sarah Bernard and me, Maliha Sayed. The story editor and executive producer was Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to Crosscut Reports wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. Also, if you would like to support the work we do at Crosscut, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Seattle's PBS station, KCTS 9. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. That's also where you'll find a text version of the story we discussed today. Crosscut Reports is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Maliha Sayed. We'll be back soon with another episode.